go now again for the question and answers part. So we already have all your questions from the last session in the list, don't worry. I know my colleagues Faustina and Carolina has been looking through them very carefully, trying to combine some of them, and we have a good 5 minutes, 4 to 5 minutes now to discuss only with Manuel before we go to the panel discussion where we have still more time to question and answers. So Manuel, I would first ask you one of the questions chosen in advance. So the first one in line, when dividing the different data sources and users, how do you see the integration of the forest and landscape restoration field data into public sector monitoring frameworks? And for example, public information sharing in the media and so forth. Manuel, can you just...
Yes. Yes. Thank you, Maria, for the question, and thank you, everyone, for attending the webinar. That's a very critical issue, and there are not too many examples worldwide in which you have, these systems that integrate subnational, national, and probably global aspirations or needs. So, what a project manager or a project implementer needs to be mindful of is that participation in the first place needs a common vision, and that vision may vary within a country and within a watershed or within a community or among communities. And it's also a long-term process, and as long as all stakeholders have a shared vision that are aware that may change over time, the project manager or implementer needs to be attentive to these dynamism, which is inherent to forest landscape restoration. And national governments also change priorities. So it's a moving target. The key, in a way, is to see forest landscape restoration as a means to an end, not an end in itself. So the way one way to attack the problem, or at least one way to learn from this, is by truly fomenting a participatory approach for national and subnational decision making. And again, when we carried out the review that I showed in the presentation, we struggled to find true subnational, local to state or national systems that satisfy both local and national needs. There was one case from Brazil and one case from the United States. So it's not easy, and it requires also substantive investment and a long-term vision, which in the case of the United States Forest Service example, these were projects that were funded for not less than 10 years. And that's not very common across many countries. So it's quite challenging, but I think there's a need to invest in really connecting the dots and move from isolated projects that in itself can benefit local aspirations, but we need to think really deeply into how to upscale, at least from the subnational to the national, if we want the global forest landscape restoration movement to really take over and be meaningful for degrading land, for overcoming degradation, and also for local livelihood.
Thank you, Manuel. It is great that we dive now more into the monitoring aspects, which is definitely an area under development, let's say. Let me take one of the clarifying questions from the floor, also dealing with participatory monitoring. Could you explain how to address the challenges in making sure that marginalized sections of the community, let's say often women, indigenous people, are actively participating in the monitoring?
Yes, that's a very good question. You need, first of all, to address power imbalances. And again, the process of forest landscape restoration involves from the outset negotiation and sharing a common view. So whoever is managing a project or an initiative has to be mindful that power imbalances will arise from the national government to the subnational or within a community. So there needs to be a strong negotiation component in that. and you need to bring women. Of course, women see restoration outcomes and restoration aspirations differently than men. And in our experience, at least in the review that we put out, what worked better was groups of mixed gender, not only women, not only men, but having both gender in a community. It's at least there's one paper that from Africa that showed that it was clearly more advantageous to have mixed gender groups than either one.
All right, excellent. Thanks a lot. There is a new question also from the floor, again about the incentives. We discussed this with Mchich already. What types of incentives have you come across or could encourage different groups to continue monitoring once a project and its funding actually ends? This is often, of course, the difficult part when the funds end, then the activities also end, and we really need the data on the longer term monitoring. This is for you, Manuel.
Yes, thank you. That's a real challenge, as you say, Maria, and thanks for the question. There are many types of incentives. You can have payments for environmental services. In other words, you restore a degraded watershed, and the local community may benefit, through a non-governmental organization or the government itself, to promote that activity over time. There are non-fiscal incentives or non-economic incentives, and that can translate into enhance ownership, or at least access rights to the resource. So there are many ways of attacking the problem. I cannot give you a comprehensive list, but I think the key is to really work as researchers and as implementers and as project managers to work towards a culture of monitoring and create and communicate to many stakeholders the value of why monitoring is important. Once the project ends, well, that's also a really important issue, and the key is to try to move out from the project mindset and link projects or initiatives to the broader sustainable development plans at the national level, and that in itself is also a challenge. But again, if you have appropriate institutions at the national level in which you can convince that monitoring pays and that monitoring benefits local communities, I think you've gained some grounds there. At the very local level, it's also a matter of, if you are working at the very, very project level, to strategically pick a community or an area or a watershed where the chances of success of your intervention are the highest. And that relates to one of the slides I was showing, that many projects don't look at the past, and many projects don't really find out in an intensive way what has worked and what has not. Why do people plant trees? Why do people like this tree species versus another one? So those types are very basic questions and most of the time overlooked. And if you find the right motivation or you find the right variables, you've gained some grounds, and that can probably save you 1 or 3 or 4 years of project money and project
Thank you, Manuel.
time.
Let's open now the floor to all panelists, so we can hear views from others as well. In the first phase, I would actually open the floor in the order of the names here. So Christine, Vale, you haven't been able to speak yet, so I would ask all of you if you have any comments to each other's presentations or the questions that you've seen coming from the floor, or anything you want to bring up at this point before we go for more detailed questions. So Christine, handing over to you. Remember to unmute your microphone and mute afterwards, so we keep this level of volume nice. Okay. Marie-Christine, can you hear me? All right, here we go. Do you have any comments? Yeah, very good. Do you have any comments to what you've heard so far in this session?
Actually, I agreed with what Manuel had discussed, that for restoration process, it is negotiation really is very important. So I agree with him.
Thank you, Christine. So you are underlining the need for negotiative approach, landscape approach, let's say. How about you, Jordi? Do you have any insights or even questions for other speakers that you want to bring up at this point?
Yeah, many, because there have been many interesting ideas here. So for example, I think something that Manuel has mentioned, and I think is worth emphasizing, is that we need, when we start a participatory process, we need to make sure that we can end up with a shared vision. And I think that's very important, and to know which are the key stakeholders, especially those that may be relevant, may have a relevant role in implementing the restoration, and make sure that we can arrive to a common vision. Yeah, I think that's crucial for the success of the participatory process.
Thank you, Jordi, for this insight. How about you, Mchich? Do you want to bring up some ideas that came from Manuel's presentation or something else during this session?
Well, just I want to insist on the fact that I think participation should be seen in the restoration process, should be seen not as a formality, as just justification. We want to participation just for participation. No, but we have to opt for a deep process in which stakeholders, everyone, should have a relevant role, should be considered as a decision maker. In this way, people will be happy and will feel comfort to participate and to give his or her opinion, and to feel himself contributing and doing something in the restoration process. So I insist not to consider, not a top-down approach, to consider participation as administrative formality, but something that is more deeper than that.
Thank you, Mchich. And now, last but not least, Manuel, do you want to bring up some thoughts that came out during the presentation of Mchich, for example?
Yes, certainly. Let me just go back a little bit and emphasize the issue that was just mentioned. For many, monitoring is a burden, and many government agencies, in my experience, see it as something not worthwhile investing in. And somebody mentioned, or I think I saw it in the list of questions, the citizen science. And citizen science is becoming a very powerful means for upscaling. In South Africa, there's a citizen science initiative or activity that involves bird counting. And that is upscale at the national level in order to see the status of biodiversity from a completely ornithological perspective. So there are tools that can really link the local with the national, and that can also be fun for those who take the data. Bird watchers are not restorationists per se, but the message that I'm trying to transmit here is that you need to be mindful when you create a participatory system of not imposing excessive costs, making the activity worthwhile for those who are on the ground, and one way or the other, make it fun. So that's at the heart of citizen science, and there are so many millions of data points that are being collected through citizen science nowadays and are transmitted through GeoWiki that is impressive. And the amount of projects or initiatives that involve restoration are minimal. They deal, in the right way with, disease or vaccination levels, but the FLR dimension has been hardly explored from a citizen science standpoint. So there are many opportunities to really involve not necessarily the local communities, but the private sector and professionals in upscaling data from a given intervention.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
May I add something?
Yes, yes, please do. Go ahead. Go ahead, Jordi.
Just to emphasize the importance of evaluation. I have I'm familiar with drylands especially, and there are so many examples in dryland restoration where we are actually restoring what has been restored in the past. And I think the main problem in those plantations that failed, on those massive diebacks, is the main problem. It was not that they didn't master the ecological techniques, but they didn't bother to measure, to evaluate what they were doing. So it's really urgent that we develop evaluation and monitoring systems that are operative. And I think there are not magic recipes for those evaluation protocols. I think they should be tailored to the necessities of each restoration project. So they may be tuned with the objectives of the project.